it's Nico. I have a lot of new books to show you today. 2 are brand new books, one published just last year. The rest are secondhand bookshop finds. The joy of going to a secondhand bookshop is not just going home with more books, it's the excitement of a treasure hunt that I love most. You go with or without a shopping list in your pocket. I had a list in this case, and you search for them in different sections on dusty shelves, and you come across things that you don't have in mind at the beginning or you don't know about, and you pick it up and try to evaluate on the spot. Do I want to take a risk with this stranger? It's even more exciting when you do find a book that you specifically search for, and I did manage to hunt down quite a few treasures. Firstly, a poetry collection by Edward Lear. I first heard of Edward Lear from my mother-in-law. I said how I struggled with poetry, and she sympathized, saying her level of poetry is Edward Lear. I didn't know who that was, but kept the name in mind. Then I realized The Owl and the Pussycat was written by Edward Lear, and I have read that poem before. It's actually the picture on the front cover. It's like connecting the dots, all very interesting. Edward Lear was an English artist, illustrator, musician, and author and poet during the Victorian era, who is known mostly for his literary nonsense in poetry and prose. I only know him for his literary nonsense. I had no idea he was also an illustrator and musician. He played many musical instruments, and he composed music for many romantic and Victorian poems. And he was known best for his many musical settings of Tennyson's poetry. I don't quite know what that means. Musical settings. Does it mean he composed music for while the poems were read out loud, or music for the poems to sing along? I have no idea. If you know, please leave me a comment. His painting is also beautiful. This edition is full of illustrations. I'll show you a few. You can't quite call them beautiful as his paintings, but he definitely has a style. I was very glad to find this beautiful Penguin Classic edition in excellent condition. I couldn't resist buying a poetry collection with the complete nonsense as its title. It also includes stories, letters, alphabets, and recipes, accompanied throughout with his fantastical line drawings. Edward Lear was brought to my attention again recently when I did research on the Napoleon of Notting Hill. G.K. Chesterton compared and contrasted the nonsense poems written by Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll in an essay called A Defense of Nonsense, and argued that they both wrote nonsense, but they are 2 very different types of nonsense. And in How to Read Poetry Like a Professor, Edward Lear appeared once again as an example when the book explains the sound of poetry and the spectrum of sound and sense. And Edward Lear is placed towards the end labeled gibberish. And please allow me to read you the famous The Owl and the Pussycat. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. The owl looked up to the stars above and sang to a small guitar. Oh, lovely pussy, oh pussy, my love, what a beautiful pussy you are. You are, what a beautiful pussy you are. Pussy said to the owl, You elegant fowl, how charmingly sweet you sing. Oh, let us be married, too long we have tarried, but what shall we do for a ring? They sailed away for a year and a day to the land where the bond tree grows. And there in the wood a piggy-weed stood, with a ring at the end of his nose. His nose, with a ring at the end of his nose. "Dear pig, are you willing to sell for 1 shilling your ring?" said the piggy. "I will." So they took it away and were married next day by the turkey who lives on the hill. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with a runcible spoon, and hand in hand on the edge of the sand they danced by the light of the moon. The moon, they danced by the light of the moon. Edward Thomas was a British poet, essayist and novelist from the late Victorian era to the early 20th century. He is sometimes considered a war poet, but he was rather a poet who died tragically in the war and whose main subjects were the English countryside and its people and the solitude of the observing self. This is the collected poems and war diary 1917. That's the year he was killed in France. I remember very clearly it was April last year that I heard about Edward Thomas for the first time. He was first introduced to me by Jonathan Bate in Mad About Shakespeare. I remember the date clearly because within a couple of days of reading about Edward Thomas in Mad About Shakespeare, I received a Persephone email newsletter, introduced a book they just reprinted then called As It Was, which includes As It Was, originally published in 1926, and World Without End, originally published in 1931. These are 2 memoirs by Edward's wife, Helen Thomas. I don't know anything about Helen or Edward or his poems, except I loved reading the chapter about them in Mad About Shakespeare. It's a mini biography of Edward Thomas' life when they were young and Edward still an undergrad student. They walk on the common and he brings her birds' nests and wild flowers. His jacket has deep pockets, from which he pulls volumes of Keats and Shelley, Shakespeare and Donne. Jonathan Bate is well known for his biographies for literary figures. I won't be surprised if he publishes one on Edward Thomas at some point in the future. The chapter is short and he only gives a snapshot of Edward Thomas' depression, his essays and poems, his life with Helen, and what happened the evening before Edward left her for France and never to return. The snapshots capture the spirit of his person and his life beautifully. I want to know everything about them. I love to read Helen's memoirs and obviously Edward's poetry. I couldn't believe my eyes when I found this almost brand new edition. It's beautifully neat and clean. It has an introduction by Peter Sachs and notes on all 144 poems, giving context and background information like dates and places and people related, letters he wrote on related subjects, as well as explanations of specific words in the poems. Another literary figure mentioned in Mad About Shakespeare is John Donne. Donne doesn't get a whole chapter for himself, but what is included is no less memorable. Jonathan Bate talks about studying Donne at A-level. Although we wondered what the hell was meant by such lines as "the general bomb the hydroptic earth has drunk" in the eerily titled "A Nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day" being the shortest day, the rewards were ample. Poem after poem was about sex. And he carries on giving examples of love poems for every stage of a relationship. But for once, Jonathan Bate is not the first person who introduced John Donne to me. Before Mad About Shakespeare, I read this song by John Donne in House Moving Castle by Diana Wynne-Jones. Go and catch a falling star. Get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Teach me to hear mermaids singing, or to keep off envy's stinging, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. If thou be'st born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights, till age snow white hairs on thee. Thou, when thou return'st, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair. Apologies if I didn't read that quite right. I didn't understand all of it, but I just liked the sound of it. John Donne had a very interesting life and went through a drastic career change, and that is reflected in his subject of writing. After writing all those poems about sex that get A-level English students so excited, he became a famous preacher in St. Paul Cathedral in London later on in life. So in Norton Anthology, the collection under his name includes erotic sonnets as well as holy sonnets. This book, Super Infinite, the transformations of John Donne, jumped into the corner of my eyes seconds before I walked out of Waterstones in Carlisle. I read about it somewhere that it was the winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction in 2022. I can't find it anywhere where exactly I read about this or heard about this, but immediately I wanted to read this book because firstly it's about John Donne and I heard all about John Donne, and secondly it's written by an author, she's called Catherine Rundell, who writes stories for children. I thought a children's story writer would surely write an accessible and gripping biography. But because it's a newly published book, it was published last year, and it just won the prize, I was prepared to wait for a few years at least before the price comes down and I can get my hands on a copy. So I was over the moon when I saw it half price in Waterstones. It was almost an impulse buy, but because I downloaded the Kindle sample and tried it out already, so I felt it was okay. I have high hope for this book. Next one, The Secret Life of Poems, a poetry primer by Tom Paulin. This one indeed was an impulse buy. How did it end up coming home with me? Here's my thought process when I meet an entirely unknown book, and how I decide to buy it or not. So this was what happened. I saw this on the shelf in the poetry section and it stood out to me because it was not battered and falling apart. It was not on my list, but I couldn't help taking it off the shelf. I never heard of the author, but the dust jacket says he is a poet himself and he published 2 versions of Greek drama and several critical works, including one to do with William Hazlitt. I wasn't sure what 2 versions of Greek drama meant, but I found a list of his published works, including an adaptation of Sophocles' Antigone and an adaptation of Aeschylus' Prometheus Bound. Given my focus on English classics and ancient Greek this year, it was enough to make me think that we would have things to talk about if we were to have a cup of coffee, and I'd be interested in asking him many questions. So that convinced me of the author. What about the book itself? It says, this brief engagement with 47 poems is intended for students and readers of poetry and seeks to explain how poetry works by bringing into view the hidden order of specific poems. That sounds like about the right level. This is not an academic paper, it's for students and readers. It promises to point out the general rules as well as the unique aspects of the poems. And then flicked to the table of content to see which poets it included and recognized more than half of the names, like John Donne, whom we were just talking about, and Shakespeare, John Bunyan, John Milton, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Coleridge, Wordsworth, John Clare, and Keats, Byron, Browning, Emily Dickinson, Christina Rossetti, and Edward Thomas, Hardy, Dulwich Auden, and Ted Hughes, and many, many more. It's an excellent selection. If the author succeeds in guiding me through a poem from each of these poets, I'd have read something by all of these poets and would have learned loads by the end of it. And then I flicked randomly to sample his writing style and landed in Coleridge, Kubla Khan. Thomas C. Foster used Kubla Khan as an example in how to read poetry as a professor, so I knew a little about it. The writing style was not as conversational as Foster, but I didn't need to read each sentence 3 times before I could get the meaning. We will see how I get on with this one. Next, the Shakespeare Book. This glossy hardback book gives an overview of all Shakespeare's plays. I think it's aiming at general readers, especially if we compare it with the next book. The plays are organized in 3 stages of Shakespeare's career: the freelance writer, the Lord Chamberlain's man, and the King's man. For each play, it gives a brief summary of all the characters and then an overview of each act and scene in an infographic style and an article on the background and the key themes. I think it's great for getting a high-level view and general feel of all Shakespeare's plays in one place. I like the bold illustration style, the production photos, and the some paintings from the past portraying scenes in the plays. And I like the fact that it has an index. Index is really important to me. The Shakespeare Book is part of the series whose tagline is Big Ideas Simply Explained. It has a lot of titles like the Astronomy Book, the Math Book, the Literature Book, the Sherlock Holmes Book. I found one called Great Diaries, which displays an amazing collection of sketchbooks, journals, and letters from well-known figures in art and literature. I love how each diary shows the personality and the crafts of the owner. It inspired me to start writing in this little notebook. I've been writing thoughts and questions about the Tempest in here as I read. I have a notebook that's a diary journal for most things, but this one is small, so I'll be carrying it around for noting down quick ideas. The last one is a door stopper, The Invention of the Human by Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom was an American literary critic. I only heard about his name last autumn. I was reading Coriolanus at the time and someone lent me his copy of The Invention of the Human. That was when I first heard about this book as well. I obviously couldn't take his copy home on the train, so I've been secretly wishing for a copy of my own. So I was really glad to find this in the secondhand bookshop, and it's in a really good condition as well. It's beautiful. The book includes an analysis of each of Shakespeare's 38 plays with the thread throughout that Shakespeare invented us. I look forward to studying his points and arguments. I scanned through the article on Coriolanus last autumn. Not sure that was the best place to start with Harold Bloom. He didn't think much of Coriolanus, and I disagreed. Though, who am I to disagree with Harold Bloom? I just finished reading The Tempest and I am full of questions and nowhere near any answers. I hope this will help me with The Tempest, as well as many other Shakespeare's plays I'm going to read this year. Which title do you like the sound of? Have you read any of these authors or titles? Leave me a comment. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.